Hi, everybody. My name is Callie Wright. I want to say a quick thank you to Adam and Stephanie and Salim for putting this whole thing together. I think this is a really cool concept, and I'm super excited to have been invited to participate. So, most of you may be asking, who am I? And that's cool. Let's get some introductions out of the way. Again, my name is Callie Wright. I host a podcast called The Gaytheist Manifesto, where we explore the intersection of atheist and LGBT activism. I am a queer identified transgender woman. I've been out and pursuing transition for just a tad over 2 years now. I am an activist. I'm involved in several local organizations. I'm on the Cincinnati Steering Committee for the Human Rights Campaign, which is the country's largest LGBT civil rights organization. I also sit on the board of an organization called Heartland Trans Wellness, which is a Midwestern organization that does education, advocacy, community outreach, and support for transgender folks in the Midwest. I also may be the biggest Star Trek fan you've ever met. My favorite captain is Benjamin Sisko. Debate me, I'll win. So, real quick, I want to note that I'm going to be talking about some pretty heavy stuff in my presentation here. So just fair warning, I'm going to be talking about things like suicide, death, depression, anxiety, losing loved ones, that kind of thing. So just so you know, to be prepared for that sort of content. So I started my podcast for two basic problems. When I came out and started being involved in the LGBT community locally, I was shocked to find myself being preached at queer and trans themed events. There also are just not plain enough voices of LGBT folks in the atheist movement. And they're definitely there, and they do important work, so I don't want to be dismissive of folks like Stephanie Guttormson or Greta Christina, but there aren't enough of us, and let alone people who speak specifically out on transgender issues. So I decided that my activism should be atheist outreach to the LGBT community and LGBT outreach to the atheist community. I think this intersection creates a unique view of life, a view I like to call the gaytheist experience. Right? It's a funny joke. So let's define a few terms first. And knowing these terms isn't necessarily vital to understand the presentation, but I think they're good words to kind of keep in your back pocket so you can understand what they mean when you hear people talking about these things in the context of these discussions. So the first word is queer. Queer is an umbrella term that's used to describe anyone who isn't heterosexual. It's often used as sort of a catch-all to describe homosexual, bisexual, and pansexual orientations. Transgender. Duh. Me. A transgender person is someone whose gender identity is incongruent with their birth-assigned sex. So, an example of that would be when I was born, doctors saw a penis and said, boy, and I grew up and said, no. Gaytheism. Gaytheism is a made-up word. I didn't make it up. I'd love to take credit for it. But it's a word that I love, and it just describes the intersection of issues facing the LGBT and atheist communities. And this is intersectionality. Intersectionality is a big one. I could do probably an entire presentation on intersectionality, but basically what it comes down to, it's a concept that's used to describe the ways in which shitty social constructs like isms and phobias are all interconnected and not somehow all magically separate issues. For example, as a trans person, I'm statistically more likely to be a victim of hate violence. And if I were a person of color, it would be even higher, the likelihood of me being a victim of violence. So those two things intersect. To affect the way that we navigate the world. This graphic isn't exactly complete, but it gives a decent idea of what this looks like. And intersectionality sort of defines the kind of activism that I do, because I don't necessarily look at atheist activism and LGBT activism as if they are completely separate things. So the next question is why? Why atheism and LGBT? Why does it make sense to mix these two kinds of activism together? In short, there are a lot of reasons, but I think it may be more effective to just tell you a quick story. So, does anyone recognize her? Obviously, I can't see you to raise your hands, but So this is Leela Alcorn. Leela is a 17-year-old transgender girl. She committed suicide on December 20th, 2014. And her suicide note auto-posted to Tumblr, and she talked about being rejected by her friends, sent to conversion therapy, isolated from her friends, and eventually she chose to end her life. So we had a vigil in Cincinnati because Leela was from Cincinnati, where I live, and there were an estimated 400 people there. And even in the short time that I've been doing this kind of activism, I never thought that I would see this kind of a turnout for a trans-themed event. And there are always LGBT affirming clergy at these events, and I don't necessarily begrudge those folks being there. There are some people in the community who need that, and I'm not one to start a religious debate at a memorial service. So that's all fine, and I can usually just sort of roll my eyes and move on. There was a minister speaking at this particular vigil, and she said the words verbatim, "I believe God was a first responder on the highway that day." And that implies, of course, that her God stood by while Leela's parents rejected her, isolated her from her friends, tortured her with conversion therapy, watched her walk onto the highway, watched her get hit by the truck, and then he decided to show up. How about fuck you instead? And that was the moment that I knew that my LGBT activism had to be about atheist activism too. And there are some details in between, but the Gaytheist Manifesto was born not long after. And, these things make sense not just because the way that religion looks at queer and trans people. I mean, we know the obvious stuff, like, religious inspired bigotry. And of course, we recognize that not all religious people are bigots, but I mean, they're definitely quoting from the book, right? And so I see atheist activism as LGBT activism by proxy in that way. And, as I said before, this is more than just the obvious stuff. We've all read that we're an abomination, that having sex with our partners is a death penalty offense, that we just in general deserve death. So quick show of hands, you can raise your hand there by yourself. How many of you were once very religious or even fundamentalist? And how many of you just snapped out of it overnight? Of course you didn't. Of course you didn't. No one snaps out of being a fundamentalist religious person overnight. Maybe not no one, maybe I'm generalizing. But it's not a thing that happens often. But why? Why didn't you snap out of it right away? And the answer, at least in part, is identity. When you are a fundamentalist or even just a devoutly religious person, your religion was you, right? It was an almost inseparable part of your identity from the rest of you. Atheists often scoff at religious folks who take these debates so personally because, generally speaking, we can separate the person from their beliefs, or at least we like to say we can. But the problem is that for believers, for many or most of them, their religion is a deep-seated part of their identity as a human being. And when you attack someone's religion, they may often feel the same way I feel when people say awful things about trans people or gay people. And you and I know that those aren't the same thing, but unfortunately we're not having this debate with you and I. So for many folks, their religious beliefs are their identity. And though you and I know that religious beliefs and one's gender identity or sexual orientation aren't even the same ballpark as categories of things about you, for them it often is. And leaving that behind requires a shift in the way they view their identity. Losing your religion in many ways is trading in the identity that you grew up with, the one that you were told from day one by your parents, your friends, your teachers, your society, and the media is not only the right identity, but the default one. and that any identity other than Christian or Muslim or Jewish or whatever religion is inherently wrong and deviant. And even in some slightly more tolerant places, it's okay to be an atheist, but you better not talk about it, because just the fact that you exist is an insult. So to illustrate this point, ask yourself if this person looks familiar to you. And maybe you guessed, maybe you didn't, given the context of the presentation, that it's a pre-transition picture of me. And you'd be right. Now, this is, of course, a really superficial way to make this point, because obviously the changes in me have gone far deeper than physical transition. But the drastic difference you see in my physical appearance maps pretty closely to the difference I feel in myself. From being more comfortable in my own skin, relating to people better than I ever have, feeling feelings the way I've always felt like I should, I could probably do an entire presentation on all the things that have changed in me as a result of coming out and pursuing my transition. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that the difference I've described in myself since embracing my identity as a trans person is quite often the same change I hear people describe when leaving religion. Conversely, many of the consequences for coming out are similar, if not the same. Since I've gotten into activism, I've heard so many coming out stories and so many deconversion stories, and it's freaky how similar they are. The good and the bad. The struggles, the conversations, the hard conversations, the tears, the fighting, the questioning yourself and everything you know. And on the other side, the joy of finally being able to honestly be yourself, to live your truth, and to be comfortable with the person you are. So the thing to know about me is that I didn't grow up in a fundamentalist religious environment. There wasn't really a ton of conflict. Even my fundamentalist grandma wasn't a huge deal. My mom didn't care. My friends at school didn't care. No one cared. It just wasn't a big deal. So I was a teenager before I found out what religious sentiments towards gay and trans people generally are. Does anyone else remember when Ellen DeGeneres came out as gay? Okay, well, that week is something that I will remember forever, because I was still going to church with my grandma at the time. And that Sunday, the preacher preached from the pulpit about Ellen DeGeneres coming out and how being gay is an abomination and it's a sin. And he was talking about all of these companies that had pulled their advertising from Ellen's show as a result of her coming out. And one of those companies happened to be Wendy's, which for international listeners, and I'm not sure if Wendy's is a national thing, but it's a fast food restaurant. It's an American, at least Midwestern, fast food restaurant. So guess where Grandma and I went for lunch that day? Where she was sure to tell the 16-year-old girl working the window that we were there to support their firm stand on morality. I was 13, and that was my first taste. And because I didn't grow up in an oppressive religious environment, a lot of this stuff was kind of lost on me at first. Even after starting the podcast, I didn't really get how deep this connection can go. It took getting involved in the atheist community and listening to people who came from those environments for me to really get it. So, to elicit the same reaction from you that I had during this experience, I want to play a game. I'm going to show you several quotes on struggling with religious, sexual, gender identity, but with certain identifying words taken out. And I want to see if you can spot the difference. It makes you feel inferior, like you're not quite human. I kept it to myself for a long time because I was afraid to talk to other people about it. I've been so careful about hiding stuff from my dad, but he saw my today. He preached at me for hours and I've had panic attacks ever since. I knew if I came out, I would lose my job. I pretend to be just to be accepted by my best friends. I pretend to be at work because my boss is really conservative. My dad told me my sister got cancer because I don't know what to do. I think my husband knows. He'll make me leave if he finds out. I can't lose my kids, but I don't know how long I can keep this up. It's pretty creepy, isn't it? And so now that my persuasive powers have convinced you of the intersectionality between religious, gender, and sexual identity, you may be asking yourself, why does all of this matter so much? After all, the last few years have been pretty great for the LGBT movement, right? All throughout 2014 and the first half of 2015, courts ruled again and again in favor of the right of gay couples to be married, leading up to the United States Supreme Court eventually deciding in favor of gay marriage on June 26, 2015. On June 9th, 2014, Time magazine featured a trans woman, Laverne Cox, on their cover for the first time. In July, she became the first transgender actor to be nominated for an Emmy Award. In January of 2015, the Amazon series Transparent won a Golden Globe for Best Television Comedy or Musical. In 2015, President Obama became the first president to mention transgender people in a State of the Union address. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter announced the military's planned lifting on the ban of transgender people from serving in the U.S. military. And of course, none of us can forget Caitlyn Jenner's coming out. But, and I'm sure you knew this part was coming, we have a long way to go. And I'm going to tell you two stories here that kind of painfully illustrate the point. So the Supreme Court case that eventually made it to the Supreme Court and decided on marriage equality for me and every other queer person who may want it, has another story. And it's a story you don't often hear about in the media, but it's one that I think is equally important to tell. So on your right here is Jim Obergefell, with his husband John Arthur on the left. They'd been together for 20 years. They talked about marriage, but never talked seriously. They wanted their marriage to have the same legal recognition as everyone else's. And in 2011, John was diagnosed with ALS, which is also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, which, for those who don't know, is a horrible degenerative disease that eventually robs you of your ability to control your body and eventually robs you of your life. And in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down a key provision of the Defense of Marriage Act, which let the federal government confer federal benefits to legally married same-sex couples. So Jim read the headline, he leaned over, kissed John on the forehead, and said, "Let's get married." Now, being as I am from Ohio, they still couldn't get legally married. So they chose Maryland, which I guess was the closest state it was legal in at the time. But by then, John was almost on his deathbed. So they had to do a Facebook campaign and eventually raised $13,000 for a medical transport plane to get them to Maryland. And once the plane landed, they were married on the tarmac. And because Ohio is, in fact, the worst state ever, that's not where Jim and John's journey ended. Eventually, they recognized that because their marriage wasn't legal in Ohio, that Jim's name wouldn't be on John's death certificate as the surviving spouse, and that their family burial plot wouldn't allow them to be buried together because their marriage wasn't legally recognized in Ohio. And that's when they filed suit. And there are, of course, many, many details in between, but the long and short of it is that Jim's case, along with 3 others, made it to the United States Supreme Court and won marriage equality for all of us. The catch here is that John Arthur didn't live to see this. John lost his fight with ALS 3 months after he and Jim were married. Jim had to celebrate his victory without John at his side. So we won a great victory, and it's something that's super important and super historical. But I think it's worth keeping the context in mind that this case began not even with the couples want to be treated equally in their lives together, but in death, and that death took one of them before they could win their fight. So you heard me earlier mention Leela Alcorn. Leela was the 17-year-old transgender girl who committed suicide after being rejected by her parents, isolated from her friends, and sent to conversion therapy. And her suicide note auto posted to Tumblr where she described these things. This is where it gets a little tough. I am going to read some highlights from Leela's suicide note. When I was 14, I learned what transgender meant and cried of happiness. After 10 years of confusion, I finally understood who I was. I immediately told my mom, and she reacted extremely negatively, telling me that it was a phase, that I would never truly be a girl, that God doesn't make mistakes, that I'm wrong. If you're reading this, parents, please don't tell this to your kids. Even if you're Christian or against transgender people, don't ever say that to your kid. That won't do anything but make them hate themselves. That's exactly what it did to me. My mom started taking me to a therapist, but would only take me to Christian therapists, who were all very biased. So I never actually got the therapy I needed to cure me of my depression. I only got more Christians telling me that I was selfish and wrong, and that I should look to God for help. I formed a sort of fuck you attitude towards my parents and came out as gay at school. I was thinking that maybe if I eased into coming out as trans, it would be less of a shock. Although the reaction from my friends was positive, my parents were pissed. They felt like I was attacking their image and that I was an embarrassment to them. They wanted me to be their perfect little straight Christian boy, and that's obviously not what I wanted. So they took me out of public school, took away my laptop and phone, and forbid me of getting on any sort of social media, completely isolating me from my friends. This was probably the part of my life when I was the most depressed, and I'm surprised I didn't kill myself. I was completely alone for 5 months. No friends, no support, no love, just my parents' disappointment and the cruelty of loneliness. I've decided that I've had enough. I'm never going to transition successfully, even when I move out. I'm never going to be happy with the way I look or sound. I'm never going to have enough friends to satisfy me. I'm never going to have enough love to satisfy me. I'm never going to find a man who loves me. I'm never going to be happy. Either I live the rest of my life as a lonely man who wishes he were a woman, or I live my life as a lonelier woman who hates herself. There's no winning. There's no way out. So there was a worldwide outpouring of love and support for Leela and for the transgender community. We held 2 vigils in Cincinnati, and they were even held as far away as the UK. And forgive the terminology, but this was hailed as sort of a come to Jesus moment for society regarding transgender issues. And the phrase I kept hearing over and over and over again is that this is such an awful situation, but at least people are finally talking about it. The problem here is that a 17-year-old had to commit suicide before people would do that. Many trans kids who already feel like their lives are worth nothing because no one seems to care about them, they see a note like Leela's where she admonished us to fix society, and they see her get turned into memes and hashtags and bumper stickers and news coverage, and the message they get is that that's what they have to do for their lives to matter. They'll get the love and support they crave if they kill themselves. Now, reading Leela's note absolutely wrecked me for a few different reasons. I mean, obviously, this was the last writing of a 17-year-old who had committed suicide, and that's sufficiently tragic without knowing any other details. But to know that religion played a part in all of this, if not the whole part, the Alcorns, I have no doubt, are people who genuinely loved their child, but their God blinders let them ignore the hurting child in front of them in favor of what they wanted their God's purpose for her to be. And the other reasons are more personal. I mean, the last bit where she talked about not being able to find a life worth living post-transition, that hit me like a punch in the stomach. It's literally that fear that kept me in the closet until I was 28. Would I be outright rejected by the people that I love? Would I be an object of pity, getting pats on the back for having the courage to be me, but having my entire life reduced to just this one facet of my identity? Would I ever be happy with the way I looked or sounded as a woman? Would I always feel like an imposter because of the way that my body looks? I remember driving home from work one night when things got particularly bad and thinking to myself, maybe I could crash my car in a way that no one would realize that I was trying to kill myself and it would look like an accident. And I remember going to bed every night sometimes thinking to myself, things might be better if I didn't wake up tomorrow. It would be better than the way I feel right now. Now, lest you think I came here simply to depress you, there is another side to all of this. Hearing many folks talk about their experiences as queer, trans people can sometimes make it sound like it's an abjectly miserable experience. And I mean, frankly, sometimes it is. Having hate directed at you is exhausting. Hearing news stories about trans people committing suicide every other day tears me apart. And hearing people preach allyship and then turning around to act against me, that really hurts. But if I want someone to take a single thing away from my story, from any difference that I'm part of making in this world, from anything that I accomplish, it's that I'm not exceptional. Despite the challenges we face from ourselves and the world around us, given support from our friends, families, and communities, and with access to competent medical care, we can and do thrive. Anytime someone's complimentary of me for being so open and so honest about my story, I always remind them there's no way in hell I'd be doing any of this without my support system. Support systems are vital for anyone, but especially for people who are vulnerable in the way that many or most trans people are. Coming out for me was not an act of courage, it was an act of desperation. And the support I received allowed me to step out just a little further. And with each step that I took, I was met with overwhelming love, validation, and support from my friends, my family, and my community. And I'm here today because of that love and support. I'm literally the person I am today because of that love and support. Coming out was the single most terrifying thing I've ever done in my life. It's a rare occasion that something that personal gets exposed to the general public in that way. But if I was going to deal with who I was, I didn't have a choice. Living my life as the person I've always known myself to be has been the most liberating and joyous experience of my life. It gets really hard sometimes between depression, dysphoria, and the pressure that society places on me and others like me, but I've never been happier in my life. I've never been more comfortable in my own skin. I've never felt better about the way I relate to people. And I've never felt more free. The problem with religion is not that its ideas are incorrect. There isn't a person watching this that hasn't been just plain spectacularly wrong about something. The problem with religion is dogma. Following a religion in many or most cases means subverting your own capacity for reason and judgment to an outside authority that hasn't deemed it appropriate to speak to us for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. Is it really any wonder then that religions are generally so hostile to shedding the dogma that surrounds gender identity and sexuality? The dogma of one man, one woman, or born a man, always a man, born a woman, always a woman. These concepts don't exist because they're good ideas. They don't exist because they're likely to make anyone's lives happier or any better. These dogmas exist because a religion said so. And to speak out against the dogmas surrounding gender and sexuality is very directly to speak out against the outmoded thinking of Bronze Age philosophers about who we are and who we should love. I believe with all of my heart that for equality, the secular community is the place to be. It's we as secular humanists, as atheists, as free thinkers, who can look at our queer and trans family without blinders on and say, all I need to know about you is that you're a human being. You deserve equality simply by virtue of existing. and you shouldn't have to earn that. As atheists, we know that religion has been and continues to be an impediment to almost all human progress. It's by fighting the notion that faith is a good way to know things and by embracing reason that we allow ourselves to see our fellow human beings for who they truly are. I couldn't begin to say enough good things about the atheist community, and not only the way I've seen us embracing this change, but the way I've seen us actually be a part of making this change happen. So, friends, as much as there is to celebrate and has been to celebrate, there is a lot more that we have to do. The secular movement should be leading on these issues, and I believe we can lead on these issues. I've seen, heard, and felt the love this community is capable of. So let's continue to stand with our queer family. Let's reach out and lift up and embrace our transgender family and push hard and without apology to full equality and freedom for all of us. We're a long way from it, but with you guys as allies, I have no doubt we'll succeed. Thanks for watching.